is the Bible? The Bible is made up of two parts. The first part is the Old Testament. It contains these different sections. The Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The former prophets, which are also known as the historical books, which starts at Joshua and goes to 2 Kings. The later prophets, which are like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12 smaller prophets. The wisdom writings, which is Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes. And then what is called the writings. So oftentimes the Psalms are in there, Chronicles, Daniel, and some other books. The New Testament is made up of 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Acts of the Apostles, Paul's letters, general epistles like Hebrews, James, and epistles is just another word for letter, and then the book of Revelation, which is an apocalyptic form of writing that we'll talk about down the road. When we talk about the Bible, we talk about the biblical canon, and a canon is the official list. Books that are accepted as authoritative. So we have an Old Testament canon with the books that are in it that are seen as having authority. We have a New Testament canon, and then we think of the Bible as a whole. There are also books called the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books. Protestant Bibles tend to not have these. The Catholic and Orthodox Bibles do. They fill in the gaps between kind of the time of the Old Testament and the New Testament, books like Sirach and Maccabees. Now, the Bible that I'm asking you to have has the Apocrypha in it, because we are going to talk about the Apocrypha at a certain time. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the canon. Where did the Bible come from? How did the New Testament get put together? So first of all, you have the Old Testament canon, which was formed long kind of before the New Testament came around, and there are 2 versions of it. There's the Hebrew version, and then there's the Greek version, and the Greek version is simply the Hebrew version translated into Greek, which is called the Septuagint. The Old Testament, again, is made up of the law, the prophets, and the writings. The New Testament, though, canon, comes about a little differently. It develops from the 1st century to the 4th century. Probably the earliest book that we have written is the letter that Paul wrote to the church in Thessalonica. And maybe the latest book we have is the book of Revelation, which comes towards the end of the 1st century. But we have the 1st century to 4th century here because the canon really didn't get firmly established until about the late 300s. So the list of books as we have it now was first listed by Athanasius in a Christmas sermon in about 380 AD. So the question then is, why did it take so long, and what were the criteria of inclusion? It's important to see that during the 1st century all the way up until the 4th century, there were different lists. And some of the lists included some books and didn't include others. And so how did books end up kind of making the list in the end? Well, first of all, a book had to have apostolic authority. What that meant is somehow the book needed to be traced back to an apostle, somebody who first lived and saw and experienced Jesus. Now, if you think about the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, only 2 of them are apostles, Matthew and John. So what about Luke and Mark? Well, Mark's Gospel, actually, if you read it, shows that it's grounded in kind of Peter and the authority of Peter. Luke's Gospel is believed to be focused on Paul. Luke was somebody who traveled with Paul. So even in those 2 books, you can actually find a way to trace it back to apostolic authority. We also have the issue of the use in the churches. So what churches were doing with these books early on is they were passing them around to different churches and they were reading them. And so when they began to put together the criteria for inclusion of the books they thought that had authority, they began to look at, well, which books are being read in the churches? And so those books that had high usage within the church were seen as having authority. And then books with a common message and theme, they didn't want a book to contradict. What's really important here to recognize is that by the late 1st century, there was an unofficial canon. They already agreed upon about 90% of the books that should have been there. So the core of the New Testament, which are the Gospels and then the book of Acts and some of Paul's letters. The issue was really with some of the other books on the periphery. There were books that were questionable. So which books are these? 2nd Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Revelation. You also had books like The Shepherd of Hermas and the Letter of 1st Clement, which books were books that made some of the early lists, but didn't make the final list. And so how do we kind of, make sense of some of this? Well, here's Eusebius in Church History 325. Basically what he does in this little piece is he says, here are the books that are questionable. And you can see that you have James and Jude, the 2nd Epistle of Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and then the Shepherd of Hermas, the Apocalypse of Peter. And what's going on at this time is the church has to kind of decide upon these books because you're getting all these kind of different false teachers and heretical teaching that's going on. And so the church, in response to kind of its false teachers or heresy, begins to have to say, these are the books that have authority. These are the books that we go to. Now, it's not to say the Shepherd of Hermas or the Didache, the teachings of the apostles, or these other books aren't important. In fact, many of the confessions of some of the churches say we should still read some of these books. They're not bad to read. But the reason they're not included is because the church was saying these are not the books that are authoritative. And the canon becomes kind of the measuring stick. It becomes a marker that says these are the books that we go to say that we have authority. And so when we gather together to worship on a Sunday morning, we're reading from these books because these books are the ones that are seen by the Christian community to speak about God's action and how God is at work in the people of Israel and how God is at work in the person of Jesus Christ. So the next issue that we'll take on is the question, well, what actually is the Bible? So we talked a little bit about how it was put together, but then what is it? And then how do we read it and how do we interpret it? And we'll take that up in the next one.